Okay, we'll just give the audience a little more time here. I see a couple of people signing up, so hang on for approximately 30 seconds, and we'll get going soon. Okay. Okay, let's get started. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. The topic of today's webinar is about evolution of vendor risk management and how organizations are using a trust but verify model when it comes to assessing risks within their supply chain. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Okay. Great. Okay. Great. So let me start by introducing our guest panelists. For today's webinar, we have put together an expert panel of information security executives. Each of them have more than 15 years of experience in information security risk and compliance. I have with me Ryan Murphy. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
He's a senior information security manager for a Vine company. And also joining along with him today is Paresh Amin. Hey, Paresh.
Hi, Anup. Thanks for having me.
He is the Information Security Officer for Conduent and ex-CISO for Thales US. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Appreciate this company. So let's go to the topics we have for today's webinar. Okay, so there will be three key topics we will be covering today. The first topic is the evolving regulatory landscape regarding vendor risk, the trends, challenges, and strategies in building a program around vendor risk management, and what are the key steps you have to take to build up a solid foundation for a vendor risk management program. Okay. So before we start discussions around these topics, I would ask the panelists to have some opening commentary going on. So Ryan, Paresh, would you like to share some initial thoughts on these topics? Paresh?
Sure, of course. So first of all, thank you, Anup, and welcome everyone that's on the call. Ryan, also great to join you again on the webinar. I think you'll all agree that vendor risk is certainly an important topic that is getting a lot of attention over the last 2 or 3 years. And these are certainly exciting and scary times. It seems like every time you turn on the news, another company got hit with a data breach. And frankly, I think it's only going to get worse as time goes on. To me, there seems like there's a perfect storm brewing where you have multiple vectors that seem to be coming together. For example, one, you have regulations like PCI, FINRA, HIPAA, that are all now requiring a more formal process in conducting vendor due diligence. And then two, you have company boards that are looking for greater visibility of where risk lies within their supply chain. And then three, customers are now also requiring their companies that they're doing business with to implement and show proof that they have a robust vendor risk management program in place as well. And then finally, you know, most times it's your vendors that are getting the breach, and it's the malware and the virus that's coming over trusted and sometimes unmonitored network connections into your environment. Hackers are definitely looking at vendors as the easy target to ultimately get into corporate environments. So I think the topic is very relevant, and I'm glad to be on today's webinar.
Ryan?
Yeah, just following up on that, this is Ryan. Thanks again for having me. You know, I think Paresh really hit the nail on the head there. I think in the last few years, you know, as we've seen increased reliance on cloud and third-party vendors, you know, this has kind of been, you know, an area of risk that has really come to the surface. And I think, you know, companies have had a challenge coming to grips with this because as we talk about the trust but verify model, you're working with third parties, and in some cases, there are only so much that they're willing to divulge about their security postures. So it's a big challenge, but as you know, things increasingly go to the cloud and away from our own data centers and things like that, it's just increasingly important. And anything we can do to kind of shore up these third parties you know, it just secures us from a risk perspective. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Paresh. Just a note for our audience, and you will have a lot of questions when we go through these topics. I highly encourage you to use the Q&A questions and chat tools, which GoToMeeting already has when you signed in. So let's use that, and definitely when time permits, we'll go through these questions probably towards the end of this discussion here. Okay, so let's move on. The first topic. Okay, the first topic we have is around the evolving landscape around vendor risk management and what practices organizations are adopting to meet these stringent demands when they have to go through vendor risk assessments or when they conduct vendor risk assessments. Ryan, do you want to take this on?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important for companies to really take a data-centric approach when they do their vendor risk management. What I mean by that is, you know, there's certain data that is fairly inconsequential to the company, right? And there's certain other data, maybe regulated, maybe not, maybe company confidential, that's really what the company cares about and is important. So I think that's important to kind of really determine what level of due diligence needs to happen in the vendor assessment. You know, for example, regulated data, you really need to go quite in depth in terms of gathering maybe third-party security assessments they've done, reviewing those with a fine-tooth comb, having follow-up questions, meetings, calls with the vendor to make sure that they've answered truthfully and trying to uncover maybe things that seem a little bit fishy in terms of gathering associated documents, things like that. But if a vendor is fairly inconsequential in the data that they maintain, then there's not really a high level of due diligence that's required. You still maybe want to do something basic like send them a questionnaire interrogating them about what kind of security program they have, associated policies and procedures, what controls they have, what is their team like, what kind of experience they have. You know, you probably want to have that just to file away in your back pocket so there was some basic level excuse me, of assessment done there, but you don't need to go to quite the length that you do for your critical vendors, if you want to call them that, the ones that handle the data that's most important to your company. So, you know, in terms of meeting these stringent demands, I think a data-centric approach is very important, and I think we can get a little bit more into what kinds of things you can do for that stringent approach. Paresh, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think Ryan, the point you just brought up was excellent, and I'm thinking, you know, based on the experience I have, that, you know, if you look at the new regulatory initiatives and the pressures, it's definitely changed the conversation. It's moved from an ask phase to what I'm calling a required phase. So when it comes to conducting vendor risk assessments, organizations really need to form what I call a repeatable, scalable, and objective way to identify risk across their entire supply chain. I mean, I think the days of sending Excel spreadsheets to only a select set of vendors are definitely over. Excuses like lack of budget, resources simply won't fly anymore with auditors and regulatory officials, especially when there's now affordable solutions out there that can be implemented in days, not weeks or months. And, you know, in terms of some practices that organizations are adopting, I would say, you know, right away, the quick steps are to catalog and inventory all of your vendors. You can't remove risks that you don't know, so you need to know who your vendors are. Quickly triage them into, you know, high, medium, low type of risk buckets, and then apply the appropriate level of due diligence needed for each of the buckets of vendors. That makes sense.
Totally makes sense. I had a follow-on question here, primarily for Paresh. You mentioned repeatable processes. What do you see as the regulatory landscape evolves? What do you see in terms of standardization in terms of gathering that information? Like, for example, at the East Coast, on the financial institutions, that you have the SIG standard, SIG standard. You see that those kind of standards evolving as the vendor risk management space also evolves, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a challenge right now, and, you know, a lot of companies have taken on different, what I call risk assessment frameworks to be able to assess their vendors. And of course, those that are tied to financial are using, for the most part, the shared assessments SIG model. A lot of companies have adopted the ISO 27001, and I think the decision to pick one over another really kind of relies on, as you as the company, what vertical do you fall in, what regulatory pressures do you have, and what the landscape of the vendors look like. If you've got vendors that are placed around the globe, an ISO 27001 is going to resonate very strong, right? You're going to have high levels of acceptance and adoption because everyone around the globe understands ISO. Where if you start sending a vendor that's located in China a SIG assessment, while the questions are still security minded, it's not 100% relevant to them, the value of them filling that out versus something that's an ISO-based standard, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. I see a couple of questions coming up. We will park them for now. And like I said earlier in the opening statement, we will collect these questions, and we will, based on how much time we have, we will go through them at the end of the webinar. Perfect. Let's move on to topic number 2. Okay. So key question here really is around current challenges, trends, and strategies put in place to run a proper, effective vendor risk program. What do you see, Ryan, in your organization and organizations you have worked in the past?
Yeah, so Paresh mentioned sending out a questionnaire that the vendor would complete based on some established framework. I think that for the most part has typically been kind of the core of the whole process. So that gets sent out, the answers are received, and then you would probably gather any sort of third-party security assessments that have been done, penetration test results, SOC audits, code reviews, whatever the vendor has that can kind of help corroborate the answers that are received in the questionnaire. And then finally, there's typically like some sort of overall architecture review, one or more calls or WebEx type sessions with the vendor to kind of walk through the questionnaire, any of these artifacts that I mentioned, and really kind of understanding the culture of security and compliance at the vendor's company. And I think through those kind of 3 things, it's fairly easy to get an idea about the culture of security at the company that is being evaluated. And a lot of times, the culture can be evaluated really quite quickly. If some of these things just come back on the questionnaire as no, we don't have any sort of dedicated security team, or the director of IT runs our compliance program, or something like that, right? Very obvious issues straight up front. And then other times it takes a little more digging to try and uncover those risks. In terms of challenges, apart from, we're talking about the trust but verify model, but a lot of vendors, they're not necessarily willing to share some of these security artifacts, so that's a challenge, right? Because then you're leaning more on trust, and it's kind of hard to verify then in that case. Another thing, to Paresh's point about repeatability, as the companies I think are getting more mature in their third-party vendor risk models, you're actually having companies pushing back on the custom questionnaire that they send them any longer. They want to go with something standardized, right? And in some cases, they're kind of pre-building their own questionnaires, or they want to work with an established other third party that handles standardized questionnaires, something like that. So that's a challenge too, because you're actually getting pushback on the whole security review process for those third parties. But I think, strategy-wise, right, the strategy, again, it has to be built around that data risk model, and then, also just really having, being able to verify whatever documents they can get you.
Got it. Paresh, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, in terms of current challenges, I see a lot of companies right now, they seem to be struggling with the front end of this entire process, which is the data gathering and the data collection. And, some of the challenges that I think I've seen with my peers in the industry is, companies will try to, take this as a manual test. They'll still be using Excel spreadsheets, and they'll want to throw people at the problem. And that simply doesn't scale, right? Building an army of risk analysts will only get you so far. and for sure you'll run out of budget for headcount before you've even made a dent. So that's a failed model, right? And two, instead of spending the money to kind of outsource this to somebody who's an expert in the field of doing and conducting and facilitating risk assessments, to go on and build an in-house automated solution, that also has proven to be a waste of time. Plus, it'll end up costing more money in the long term than simply outsourcing the solution, at least for the data gathering collection piece of it. And then finally, I think in terms of strategies, I would say, use the crawl, walk, run model when implementing your vendor risk management model. Don't bite off more than you can chew. And finally, come to the realization that the problem can't always be solved with just technology alone. Make sure you pick a solution that's mature enough and has wrapped people and process around the technology platform for to ultimately be successful.
Got it. Makes sense. I had a couple of follow-on questions around the just around the team you need to put in place to run your vendor risk program. So again, you both have diverse experience. So let's say, Ryan, going to you, what kind of team typically, within your organization deals with the vendor risk program? Is it your security analyst, or do you have a separate team, reporting it to SPO, your procurement office, or how does it work in your org, just at a high level?
Yeah, so contracts plays a part of it. A lot of times they're the ones that kick off the process. They might cycle a questionnaire or something to a vendor, or get limited or basic information about that vendor. And then after that, it's primarily up to the information security team to follow through with the security design review of that vendor. And again, I stress the data-centric approach because for, let's say, low and medium risk vendors that primarily deal with, data that doesn't really matter to the company, then again, you can send and receive the questionnaire. Someone needs to simply validate those results. They don't need to be a security team member. They can be, someone that just has a limited amount of knowledge, enough to verify that the results seem accurate, at least at first glance. But you will never replace or automate, I think, true security professionals or compliance experts, if that's the case as well, for those real critical high-risk vendors, because those are the people that need to get on calls, repeated calls with the vendor, gather documents, review them with a fine-tooth comb, and know the kinds of very pointed security or compliance-related questions to really press the vendor on. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, but I think it would be a smart strategy for those low and medium risk vendors to automate as much of that process as possible, so that the security team or the contracts team isn't busy badgering vendors to complete something, or you sent in your pen test results but left off your SOC 1 and 2 results, things like that. That's just not an effective use of anyone's time. And I think, to Paresh's point, a lot of companies don't have the appetite to build this kind of system themselves. And so, automating the low and maybe medium risk vendors, it certainly makes sense. And then having a dedicated security or compliance professional really get into the high-risk ones seems like the right strategy to me.
Got it. Makes sense. One more thing, because Question Pro, the company which is hosting this webinar right now, is a SaaS company, software as a service company. What challenges do you see when enterprises are moving into into the cloud with cloud computing and SaaS-based applications? What challenges do you see with your team, Ryan and Paresh, have to deal with on a more day-to-day or a more week-to-week basis?
This is Paresh. Maybe I can take a lead on that one. So I would say for any kind of software as a service vendor, some of the challenges from an organization perspective is really around, I think, the ability to manage, control, and monitor the data, right? And that becomes critical both prior to engaging, during the engagement, and most importantly, exiting the engagement, right? Because we know no relationship will last a long time, and if you have to exit a cloud-based vendor, understanding what functionality you have to be able to properly exit out of a relationship, and making sure that your data is controlled and managed by you, so you can have a graceful exit and not have any kind of data loss or data leak during that process. That's my thoughts there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Let's move on to topic number 3.
One other thought I have on strategy for an effective vendor risk management program, if I could.
Right.
I think we haven't talked about this yet, but I do know that the cyber insurance policies that companies are now starting to get to protect themselves liability-wise in the case of a breach or loss as a result of a breach. I know some of these policies actually will cover third-party vendors. They might be more costly, but depending on what kind of cyber risk policy you get, it's certainly possible to cover some amount of damages as a result of loss from an independent third party. So just throwing that out there as well when cyber breach insurance is being looked at to see if that kind of thing is covered by the policy or not.
Great point,
That's a
Ryan.
great point.
Great.
That's a great point. You're right. And I would say I would even add to that. Not all cybersecurity insurance policies are the same. So definitely do your due diligence and make sure that things that are important to you are covered by that policy. I think from the last 2 or 3 years, cybersecurity insurance has been a big market, and depending on who the underwriter is, they cover various different aspects of the task and the cost that companies have to burden when they have a breach. So just definitely do your due diligence and make sure that when you pick one, it covers the things that you're most concerned with. So that's a great point.
Great. So let's move on to topic number 3. So 5 things both of you can put into practice to form a solid vendor risk management program. Starting with you, Paresh.
Sure. So I don't have 5. I have 6 tips, and I'm sure some of them will overlap with what Ryan will mention as well. But I'll start with number 1. And I think I mentioned this before. Start inventorying your vendor population. Right. Try to figure out exactly the gaps between the known and the unknown vendors. Number 2, I would say try to risk profile your vendors to determine, again, the high, medium, low risk vendors. Based on that, you might be able to better gauge the level of due diligence that you need to perform on each group. I would say number 3, use an automated online assessment platform to conduct the risk assessments using questionnaires and standardized scoring. This will provide what I feel would be a very objective, as I said before, repeatable, scalable way to conduct the vendor due diligence process. Number 4, assess the services that the vendor provides, not just the vendor itself. And this is important, and I think this will bring more relevance to the risk assessment process. So assessing the services of the vendor rather than just the vendor themselves. When the assessment is completed, this is number 5, I would say, and I think Ryan mentioned this as well, validate the vendor responses from the online questions to the uploaded control evidence and additional docs that have been provided by the vendor. Make sure the maturity of controls is where you need it to be. And then finally, number 6, try to enable some type of continuous monitoring. We all know that throughout the year, relationship and scope of services being provided may have changed. Don't wait for the annual review to discover this and find out that the company or the vendor has changed hands multiple times and none of your old agreements are now enforceable. And this can be done fairly quickly using some type of quarterly or semi-annual quick questionnaire checkup. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Any commentary from Ryan on these?
Yeah, I think Paresh nailed that. I don't know that I have another major topic to add to that or practice. I guess I would say, and he talked about, reviewing these things annually or more frequently to see if the scope has changed. I will say, typically there's 2 phases to the vendor risk, strategy. The first phase is when you do the initial assessment that I think we've talked about at length here. The second phase too is a lot of times during implementation, the security and compliance teams still need to be involved to make sure that things are implemented, maybe system interfaces, any sort of APIs that get built, things like that, to make sure that those are implemented in the way that was discussed during the initial assessment, because the initial assessment is kind of theoretical in a lot of ways about maybe how system interfaces work and things like that. But then when things get down in the weeds and implementation starts beginning, a lot of times shortcuts can be taken that kind of stray from the blessing of what was originally discussed with the security and compliance team. So I guess if I had to come up with a 7th thing, it's really being involved in the integration to make sure it lines up with the initial assessment.
Perfect, perfect. I don't see any questions on this topic. Maybe you guys have exhaustively addressed this, which is great. And let me move on to I think there are other questions that popped up. So I will start with selecting some of these questions which have just come in. So let's start with the question I have here coming from Sandra, who is a practicing information security officer. So besides using questionnaires to assess vendor or vendors, how valuable are some of the newer services out there that provide a digital footprint of a vendor based on publicly exposed systems / IP addresses? Paresh, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think there's been an emerging trend the last couple of years, and there's companies that are out there, and I'll just mention a few, Security Scorecard, BitSite, and they all provide a great service. And this idea of basically taking what a company has put out on the public web and then looking at the cadence of those assets in terms of certificates that may be expired or not expired, strength of the cipher that's being used, patching cadence, things of that nature. I think they're all good data points, but at the end, it's a single data point, one of many that truly need to be understood to get a good visibility on risk with your vendor. I would say don't rely solely on these types of services. Combine them with a questionnaire approach if you really want to get the best focus of risk within that vendor. Additionally, this is very interesting. I think additionally, there's now a newer set of vendors and service providers out there that will now monitor the dark web, social media channels, and other private and public sources to inform you more about your vendors and their security practices. And there's a couple of companies like ZeroFox and Digital Shadows. Again, all good stuff, but none of these should be used alone to determine true risk to your data or your client's data. There's no greater way to capture accountability that comes from a direct response from a vendor on the existence of an IT control and its implementation maturity than asking it point directly to a vendor through a questionnaire. That's my thought there.
Perfect. Yeah. Ryan, any
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with Paresh. These kinds of companies, it's valuable as a data point, but you can't overly rely on them. I think it helps build an overall picture of risk with a vendor. But some of the caveats that you'll see, or the issues you'll see with these kinds of providers. Just for example, I'm familiar with BitSite, and um, they essentially are cataloging all the IP addresses for an organization that are available that they can see on Aaron or something like that. And some of those IP addresses, right, they may be, even though they're owned by a vendor, they may be like guest networks or something like that. And so the incidence of malware on a guest network, when it doesn't occur on a production network, could give you a false sense of insecurity for that given vendor. And so you really can't rely on it, but in general, it's a useful data point, and it's also a useful talking point with the vendor. If you're assessing a high-risk vendor, right, you can bring up this kind of report card and say, well, you've had this incidence of malware in the last 30 days, and you have certificates expired on, these 5 boxes. What's going on there, and give them an opportunity to explain it, right? Hey, these ranges are guest IP ranges, and these expired certificates are test dev DMZ that's completely isolated from any production network, something like that. So it's useful as a data point, but take caution.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Again, Ryan, I think one point you did bring up earlier in the webinar is the assessing the culture and the processes in place do require, going back to what Paresh is saying, do require straight questioning, right? And you don't get that, and you don't get that outside in digital footprints, right? So, yeah, mixed model, I guess, Paresh. That's what you're suggesting.
Yeah,
With
we'll call it
combination
a hybrid model. Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so question number 2. This came in pretty early. So how important is it to conduct validation on completed vendor assessments in terms of validating the provider responses? I guess they're talking about IT control evidences. So examples given were policy docs, past SOC reports, etc., vulnerability test, etc. So Ryan, you want to take this on?
Yeah, I think it's very important to gather and review these types of documents, especially for critical vendors, as we talked about. A lot of times, in my experience, right, the questionnaire may go out and have something that says, "Can you provide, security policies, past penetration tests, third-party security audits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And the company will reply yes to all of them, and then, of course, you request these documents, and you get some answer about being proprietary and cannot be provided, and the details of our security program would expose us to risk if we provide those, and things like that. And then a lot of times, in my experience, I will push back again and say, okay, why don't you scrub the data that you care about, but send me something, right, that has non-company specific data. And then a lot of times, after maybe a week or two, I will receive a set of security policies, and you will Google some key phrases in those security policies, and you'll see that they were lifted verbatim from some information security policy creation book or something like that, right? And so, again, right, it goes back to, in my mind, assessing a culture of security. And so in that case, you asked for the proof they said they could provide, they waffled on it for some period, and then you got boilerplate. And so in my mind, that does not lead to me feeling comfortable about there being a culture of security with that vendor. So, all that to say is it's very important, if a vendor indicates they can provide a supporting artifact, to have them provide it.
Great. Any other thoughts, Paresh?
And I completely agree with Ryan, and I would say the validation piece of it is a must, right? So there's two halves of it, right? The first half is we talked a lot about the front end, which is the data collection and data gathering. The second half is when you have all these complete assessments, what are you going to do with them? So now you got to triage them, right? And what better way to get true visibility now that you've got all this great content, which is now the next step and final step is to audit and validate, the responses that you received based on the questionnaires against the uploaded evidence and all the artifacts you just mentioned. So I think it is definitely a must, and it's something that needs to be done. Now, the approach that companies can take is either try to do it as an in-house model, or use an external validation service provider that can basically do these validations with two lines of thought. One is a compliance-based validation, which is really looking for checkbox things that really, if you said you did this, then we need these set of things as artifacts to support your response. Or I think what Ryan is alluding to is a more of a deeper risk-based validation that really kind of talks about the data flow, inputs, outputs, downstream systems, integration, and so on, so on. So I think depending on need, the type of vendor and the sensitivity around that vendor, you may have different choices in terms of what kind of auditing and validation you do for any particular vendor. Now, I want to add at a point that Ryan had mentioned earlier, which I think is really key, is that you can ask the vendor for anything. They may not provide that artifact, and in many cases I've seen, simply putting an NDA in place will kind of help broker that conversation so that they can release some more information that they were reluctant to release. So, the simple ask sometimes works, but sometimes you may have to insert an NDA. The other thing that I've seen companies use a lot, or vendors use a lot, is instead of sending what they call protected, IP, which is their policies, procedure docs, etc., they'll just fire up a WebEx, and they'll allow me to take a look at, their pen test or their SOC report in terms of, what was qualified or unqualified, versus actually handing it over to me, right? And then with the hopes of not having it kind of float out there in the wild. So WebEx is another approach to kind of still gain the same insight, but not really have the document in your hand. I just wanted to outline those two opportunities as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I've seen that as well, and it's not uncommon, and I don't think there's an issue with wanting to go over certain somewhat sensitive things over WebEx. I don't think that should really be held against a vendor, but the NDA is certainly helpful, and a lot of times it's kind of just assumed, but that should probably be in place prior to any of these activities.
Right.
Perfect. We have a little more questions coming up, but I see a general theme. So what we're going to do is, collect them. I'll ask our team here to just collect them, consolidate them, and send it to both yourself, Paresh, and Ryan after the webinar, so that we can address them later. But let's move on. I think we're running out of time too. And before we wrap this up, any final words of wisdom for our listeners, Ryan or Paresh?
Yeah, this is Paresh. I mean, I think in closing, what I'll say is, this whole topic has been about trust but verify, and I'll say, this trust but verify is the new standard when it comes to managing risk with your vendor relationships today. I'll call it even the new norm. Signed vendor agreements that outline data protection requirements are a good start, but you really need to ask some direct questions to confirm those vendors understand and are doing the things that they agreed to do for you, and then you need to monitor them on an ongoing basis for change.
Great. Okay, so one more thing just before we close this webinar is that QuestionPro does have a newly launched SaaS solution for vendor risk management, and we have a couple of customers who have already started using it. And we are more than happy to open that up to get at least 5 of your vendors assessed for free. So, just shoot us an email. I think it's already here, right? The assessments at questionpro.com. Just send us an email, and we'll get you hooked up. So before we wrap up, again, there's a $1.50 Starbucks gift card we're giving away for people who respond to a polling survey, which we'll send out after this webinar is ended. So that will give you an opportunity to get a gift card and also an opportunity to get up to 5 of your vendors assessed for free, right? So reach out to us, and thank you again to both Ryan and Paresh, walking us through this complicated landscape of vendor risk assessments, and appreciate your time.